I grew up in rural Newfoundland, and pretty much everything there is to know about me was shaped by that experience. I grew up in a culture that was very closely knit, very unique, as many of you know, and where the physical environment and the natural environment were intimately associated with our own lives. The notion for rural Newfoundlanders, as for rural peoples in many parts of the world, continuing to today, that we are somehow separate from the natural world in any sense is patently ridiculous. It sort of breaks up against any of the wisdoms that people have learned by living generationally close to nature, and sets us, frankly, on a course that I think in the end will harm nature desperately. And my life is giving to making sure that we don't. I have been in love with animals since I was a tiny boy, and I can never remember a time when I didn't love them and be fascinated with them and by them. It has never changed. It will never change. And I think to imagine for any child a world where wild creatures do not exist in abundance is a cruel thing to even imagine. It is a far crueler and amoral thing for the human race to ever work inadvertently or consciously towards. My career took me into the field of wildlife research, of course. I spent a quarter of a century living considerable parts of every year with wild creatures in very wild places, with no roads, with only aircraft access, doing the kinds of exciting things that you see on television, you know, jumping out of helicopters and darting bears and crawling into their dens and immobilizing moose and caribou and studying predator-prey interactions in exquisitely beautiful places. And all that this did was, of course, extend my boyhood belief that everything truly beautiful in the world is an extension of nature, and that the dynamics that we share with wild animals are the most profound engagements that we can have, outside of deep personal engagements with members of our own species, of course. I believe animals made us human. I don't believe we made them anything. I think they taught us who we were and what we were made of, and eventually gave us all of the amazing things that the human species is known for: intelligence, art, religion, technological advancement, the capacity for communal living, and perhaps were even a stimulus to the development of language in us as well. All of those things, I believe, arose from a time when we were deeply embedded in the natural ecology of the world. Far more so than we are today, although it is an absolutely blatant error on the part of anyone to believe that we are in any sense separate from that ecology now, or that we will ever be. These experiences that I have had, and my understandings of human evolution and of the way we came to be what we are, have fortified within me a commitment to try and find the best ways to conserve nature on this planet. And one of the things that I have endeavored to do intellectually, but which has come to me rather easily because of my personality, perhaps, or my background, is to believe that there are many pathways to the conservation of nature, and we cannot afford to throw a single one away. The notion that one model fits all for the conservation of the natural world is to me absolutely entirely absurd and cannot be defended based upon world experience in countries as different as Africa, Canada, the United States, Western or Eastern Europe, or Russia, or any other part of the planet that we might imagine. The systems are different, the people are different, the cultures are different, the realities are different, and so therefore we must strive to find the best ways to safeguard wildlife in every circumstance. And the idea that we impose a particular model on another place or another time or another culture is a very, very problematic and non-productive exercise. Just as the ecology of animals is vastly different across the globe, even within species, within their range, the ecology can vary, so the ecology of human beings is incredibly diverse. And in each culture, we tend to try to find our way towards that engagement with nature, which is inevitable. Now, why do I say it's inevitable? I say it's inevitable because, as far as I know, every single one of you in this room eats. And eventually, we produce that food either through the use of habitats that are or have been occupied by wild creatures, or we harvest those wild creatures directly ourselves. Is this not true? And if they are not wild creatures, then they are domestic creatures. And should there be any less fondness or care or concern for how domestic animals are treated than there should be for wild creatures? I say no. I say all animals deserve to be treated in the same way, but we also have to recognize that we do live within this fabric of life, and we are never, ever, ever going to escape it. It is a cruel kind of dimension, and in fact, a cruel kind of dementia, to believe that somehow we are going to separate ourselves from the natural systems of the planet. I don't know how these ideas become unfolded in the human cortex, but in the end, as great mythologists have told us for all time, such as Joseph Campbell, in the end, flesh eats flesh, and we cannot escape these natural cycles. Not in the 21st century any more than we could have in the first, or any more than we could have 50,000 years ago in our Cro-Magnon form, or 150,000 years before that, or indeed millions of years before that, in terms of the trajectory of our own evolution. We live in a time when, by virtue of our capacities, we now have somewhere near 7.5 billion of us on this planet. 7.5 billion on our way to 8, and then on our way to 9, and then some say we will even get to 10. This is very hard for me to imagine, given the circumstances that I see prevailing in many other parts of the world already, and the stresses that even we, and by say even we, I mean people with institutions, rule of law, and such opportunities, even the pressures that we are exerting upon the natural resources of our own communities and our own circumstances here. We are draining this planet, not only of its resources, but we are draining this planet of its life. We are in a period of extraordinary extinction, and as we sit in this room, and as you live the next week of your lives, some entity in the natural world will disappear. An entity that you will never know, that you will never study, that you will never realize, you will never hold in your hand, you will never observe, you will never be fascinated by, you will never have the chance to understand and enrich your own life by examining, is gone. Gone forever. We have climate change. Some people wish to still ignore the fact that something is happening to our climate. It doesn't really make any difference as the grizzly bear wanders his way into the polar bear's range and breeds with polar bears. It really doesn't matter if someone stands up and says, I don't believe in climate change. The brown bear has now reached the polar bear after a couple of 100,000 years of separation, and they are interbreeding. In First Nations languages, when you hear the First Nations people talk in the north, and they suddenly interject a term like robin in this long, wonderful, song that is their language. The reason the word robin creeps in there is because there was never any word in their language for such a bird, because that bird never reached so far north before in the 6,500 years of their odyssey of settlement in the Canadian Arctic. Doesn't matter if someone wishes to say that climate change is not occurring. And in some sense, perhaps it doesn't even matter what the cause, although obviously we have a responsibility to try and address the cause. But in the end, the reality is that this wave of extinction that we see and the changes that are going to take place on this planet for the natural world, in terms of the creation of not just disrupted ecosystems, which is what everyone seems to emphasize, but the creation of novel, entirely novel ecosystems. This is something that all of you as young students if you continue in this field or not, or simply remain interested in this field of endeavor, you will come to witness such amazing changes on this planet and in this country and in this province in your lifetimes. This is an inevitable part of your maturation and your journey through your lives now. Inevitable. So as we grow, we take from the wild others the places they need. This is the odyssey of our competition with them. This is the reality of our needs as 7.2 billion on our way to 10. And as we take the land from them, we take, of course, their chances for existence, coexistence, and abundance, and resilience. We take all that from them. These are challenges that also become manifested, of course, within our own species in terms of conflict. As many military strategists will tell you today, if you want to imagine a really, truly intense global conflict, imagine fights over water, imagine fights over land, and imagine fights over food. We have made a great deal about the battles we have fought, either directly or covertly, over the issues of energy resources, petroleum resources in particular. But let us all remember that the Central Valley of California, as we sit here this evening and speak, the Central Valley of California is running out of water, and it is not going to find its way back to it. Aquifers are being drained, and would you know, or do you know, that there are even engineering plans already developed to move water from the Great Lakes, to the Central Valley of California. That's in this hemisphere. That's in the countries of Canada and the United States, two of the most wealthy, advanced, if you will, nations in the world, with some of the greatest institutions, some of the greatest educational systems, some of the greatest GDPs and sources of wealth, and all rule of law, and all of those kinds of things. And yet we can sit here this evening talking about the reality of moving water from the Great Lakes to the Central Valley of California, because that breadbasket feeds an enormous percentage of the produce of the wealthiest nation in the world, the United States. This helps explain why I am so concerned for those creatures that have made my life what it has been, and without whom my life would have been a faint shadow of what it has been. Yet, we have a great many people who talk about conservation as though it's a club affair. You know? Kind of something that you get together periodically and talk about because it's kind of cute, or it's kind of academic, or it's kind of ideological, or it's kind of simple, really. Simple enough that we can divide it up into approaches. We can say that, oh, well, I think we should preserve everything, or someone else says, I think we should believe in sustainable use as the only option moving forward, or politicians should make this decision, government should do that, and of course individuals should drive this kind of car, and we should make this kind of decision about where our food comes from. It has always amazed me, and the longer my career goes, it amazes me more and more, how we can take this issue of conservation and believe that it is somehow simply a science, or simply a matter of personal value, simply a matter of a single ethic, simply a matter of one kind of prescription for the natural world or another. We are talking about in conservation this nexus between the worlds of politics and economics and tradition and human culture and ecology and geopolitical forces between nations. We are talking about all of that in one single problem. It is the most complicated problem in the world. I venture far more complicated than figuring out transportation systems. Far more complicated even than figuring out educational systems. And yet, in almost any political debate in our countries or anywhere else in most of the world, issues of transportation, for example, or issues of education, for example, will undoubtedly find their way into the political dialogue. Please review the latest list of comments and debates back and forth in the recent elections in the United States of America, and tell me where conservation fit in all of that. Please ask yourself and review the debates that have taken place in Canada at the federal level or in most provincial levels, and ask yourself, where is this extraordinarily complicated, so critical an issue debated or discussed as a matter of concern for elected elites or for the public or for the interaction between them? The answer is that you're going to spend a great deal of time finding nothing. Now, here again, in this world of conservation, if we strike that reality that this is not being discussed and debated, then we immediately begin to blame the other. Well, it's ridiculous that the political elites didn't talk about this. The reason it's not talked about, ladies and gentlemen, is because we don't force the issue onto the agenda. I looked for the problem and I saw it. Huh? Conservation is a never-ending task for us, ladies and gentlemen. It is not one of those things that you start as a student and then you become a mature person, or you become a member of a faculty, or you get a career in the world of science or the world of resource management or something like that, and that eventually we're coming to a point where the world is solving this problem. This, of course, is a myth. I'll come to other myths in a little bit of time, but this is one of the myths that people have. There is no silver bullet for conservation. There is no end point. It is only constant struggle. A constant effort to do the right things for humanity and to do the right things for wild creatures and the systems they depend upon. It is never going to end. It may get better at times or worse at times. But for those of you who are students who concern me most in this room, no offense to all others, but who concern me most in this room, you must understand this. This is the most important thing in the world to give your life to. There is nothing more important than this question. And in this 21st century, within another 20 to 30 years, the planet will recognize it. All of humanity will recognize it. But you will never, ever solve it. That makes the cause both extremely difficult, extremely frustrating, and unbelievably honorable and worthwhile. Despite there being a great many problems, ladies and gentlemen, we are Homo sapiens. We are this amazing primate that dances and sings, creates art, speaks to one another, and at one point broke a stone to break the sinew and bone of another creature, and eventually, in an unbroken arc, sent Voyager to Mars. Think about that. Think about the fact that when the great confrontation between Europeans and our First Nations here in this country and in the United States of America took place, and even up until no more than perhaps 100 years ago, 120 years ago, that many individual cultures, languages, the 550 or so that existed in Canada and the United States when Europeans arrived here, were still utilizing implements made from animals and from stone. And now, just 120 years later, we have found all those new planets just a few weeks ago. Being able to see from this planet that far. And not only see that far, but have an idea of what they're made of. And whether there's any chance that organic molecules exist in a formulation that might lead to some form of life. In that blink of an eye. And yet we seem unable to stop the ravages and extinctions on the one planet that right now is the only good one we have. Why is that? Because at some point in the minds of people, in society, the dream of putting something out there was important enough that we all gave to it. We gave to it intellectually, we gave to it emotionally, we gave to it politically. And somehow, in a world with all of our real problems, our real challenges, governments could say, the dream of our nation is to put a man on the moon. Did it feed anyone? Did it save anyone from disease? Am I saying it is wrong? No, I am not. For if we lose our capacity to dream, we've lost everything. But my point is, if we can do that, what can we not do? If we choose to. If the United States of America had had an Endangered Species Act, and if Canada had had SARA in 1910, 1920, here are some of the species that would have been listed on it. White-tailed deer, pronghorn antelope, American black bear, wild turkey, mule deer, elk, beavers, a host of wildlife species that today in many parts of North America not only thrive, but teem. To the extent for some of those species that would have been on the Endangered Species Act or listed by SARA, we now have nasty little slogans to say, for example, that Canada geese, which would have been on that list, by the way, are flying carp. You see that on license plates. Or that white-tailed deer are rats with antlers. Because when we have so many of something, we begin to denigrate it and think it's unimportant. Yet, had we had those pieces of legislation 100 years ago, they would have all been listed. Now, what happened to the United States and Canada where resources had been depleted to that scale by European immigrants, by the belief that the wildlife resources of North America were completely inexhaustible, by the drive to dominate nature from a religious point of view, because obviously that was man's place to do so in the Judeo-Christian ethic, where capitalism was driving the world. The Industrial Revolution had been upon us for some time, and we just felt that the best thing that we could possibly do was to take nature and to tame it and to get rid of all of this resource and to make the most we could of it as quickly as we possibly could. Why is it that today you sit in a world, and I sit in a world, and every resident of every Canadian province and every American state sits in a world where none of those species are on the endangered species list, but in fact, many, many of those species are wondrously abundant, and in some cases maybe as abundant as they ever were on this continent. The reason is because people, just like you in this room, 100 years ago, and a little more, 120 years ago, began to realize that these depletions were happening and made a conscious effort to turn the circumstance around. Now, I am used to speaking, and used to speaking to many audiences, academic and otherwise, who do not know anything about this history, about this reality that I have just described to you. Yet buried in that example and buried in what we managed to do is one of the greatest lessons for hope for the conservation of the natural world that exists on this globe. And it happened in Canada and the United States, and 99.99% of our citizens don't have a single clue about this. All historical fact, every bit of it can be traced, every bit of it can be studied, every bit of it has strong, empirical, academic, thorough, comprehensive research and analysis associated with it. The reason was because groups came together. They formed organizations. They lobbied governments. We had political elites who cared. People like Sir Wilfrid Laurier, people like Teddy Roosevelt. We had influential, wealthy people in both countries who led elites who began to describe the destruction of wildlife that was occurring in our two countries, that eventually built phenomenal treaties such as the North American Waterfowl Management Plans and so on, the great treaties between our countries and other parts of the world, that began to construct a North American system of conservation that included parks, natural areas, sustainable use of wildlife, every single kind of dimension for the safeguarding and protection of wildlife that you could imagine. Hunters and anglers played an enormous part. So did wilderness advocates like John Muir and others. So did the people who wanted to set aside wildlife refuges. The first wildlife refuge set aside in the United States of America was Pelican Island by Teddy Roosevelt, the famous the big hunter, the man who hunted all over the world, which he did. The very first place he set aside as a president was Pelican Island. And that wasn't for elephants, it's for pelicans. It was Pelican Island. He and a man by the name of George Bird Grinnell, a man who spent 40 summers with the Plains Indians, leaving New York each year to travel there, edited Forest and Stream for 43 years, was an amazing hunter and fisherman yet, but he was also homeschooled by John James Audubon's widow. And after they formed the Boone and Crockett Club in 1887 and launched the conservation movement and the sustainable use side of it in the United States of America, it eventually came to Canada, they sat down together and they said, you know what? He said to Teddy Roosevelt, he said, you know what, Teddy, we need something for, and he sought for a name. He said, we got something for the game animals, the ones we hunt and we eat and so on and so forth. We need something for the non-game. A lot of people think that term was invented in Canadian and American state and provincial agencies in the 1960s, 1970s, or 1980s. George Bird Grinnell founded the Audubon Society. This maniacal hunter founded the Audubon Society because he wanted to protect birds and non-game species. And of Teddy Roosevelt, it was said he had two loves, two great loves. One was birds, and the other was family. Yet we like to distort history, don't we? We like to distort history. We like to break it down and say that one side of the conservation equation, those people who hunt and fish, and another side of the conservation equation, those who are into preservation or wilderness protection or national parks, or somehow, they're obviously, they're different. The egg was somehow split apart. And that's our problem. That's our bloody problem everywhere. Wildlife doesn't care which part of the conservation equation you give your life to. Doesn't care how many papers you publish in one particular aspect of conservation. What wildlife needs is practical solutions on the ground to make it work, whether we like it or not. When we think of our challenges today, which I outlined, climate change, we have a lot of us crawling over the planet like ants, we're very greedy. We're a great primate. We want as much as we can possibly get. We want to keep it away from everybody else. We're really good at all of that. But you think about the challenges that those people faced 120 years ago. There were no game agencies in Canada and the United States. There were no universities teaching young people like you about wildlife management. There was not even any science of wildlife management to teach anybody because it did not exist. We had no funding mechanisms. We had no federal law enforcement, no provincial or state law enforcement. We didn't even have any of those agencies. And we think we have challenges. They had to make societies in Canada and the United States 120 years ago, or at least 100 years ago, feel that there was an absolute crisis for conservation in countries where there were still vast areas that did not even have Europeans at least living, and where most unfortunately and disastrously we had denuded native peoples from. But these people, these elected people, these elites, these average people, these people of every part of society came together and said, no way, we will not lose them. In 1912, the Boone and Crockett Club held the first exhibition of what was called Heads and Horns in New York. And the reason they had these head mounts of these animals, like elk and bison and other species, you know why they had that? A lot of people like to poke fun at that today and say, oh, that's just those, egotistical, bad people who like to go out and kill things and then put it on their wall. Do you know the reason why that was done initially? Because the banner read to the American people, come and witness the disappearing wildlife of America, because you will never see the elk again, and you will never see the mule deer again, and you will never see on and on and on and on. And out of that disaster and crisis, we developed game agencies, university programs, funding mechanisms, non-governmental organizations, institutions, and forums as we sit in here this evening. How did it happen? Did it happen because some great God arose in society and said, we are going to make this happen? Or did it happen because people cared enough to come together and say, we will not lose the wild others who made us human? And if there's anyone in this room who doubts this history, please be my guest. We need the diversity of views on conservation now more than ever. We are facing circumstances in continents such as Africa, for example, where the problems are becoming inhuman, almost insurmountable. Wildlife is being denuded at a scale that is absolutely hard for you to imagine. There are approximately 32,000 African lions left in the wild. 32,000. When Roosevelt left the White House and went to hunt in Africa, there were millions of savanna elephants. We just finished the first census of savanna elephants done in quite a number of decades, and that population is down somewhere below 400,000 animals in total. And even the best defended pieces of real estate for wildlife, such as Kruger National Park, for example, in South Africa, elephants and rhinos are poached routinely, all the time. You sit in a room, in a province of a country, on a globe, where people go into the zoo in Paris and shoot a rhino and cut its face off for its horn. We live in a world where this is happening routinely in the range states of Africa where these animals still exist, many of them in captive circumstances. We are not going to protect wildlife by relying on a single sector in society to look after it for us, whether it's government or elites or NGOs. We will safeguard wildlife because we care enough to keep them with us. And that is absolutely the only thing that is going to keep them with us. I dream of a world where the citizens of every country, as they think about their liberties and freedoms and their challenges and their opportunities, and the risks to their own existence, and when they think about their rights and responsibility as citizens, include at the top of that list their responsibility to the conservation of nature. I see no chance for the natural world to thrive in the abundance that I wish to see it unless we create a citizen movement for conservation. I work in the world of elites, the academic community, the NGO communities, the professional communities. They're all elites. I don't mean to think they're great. It's just elites. They're clubs. And we've had those for a long time. And we're still facing the challenges and the problems that we are. So any thinking human being who examines this question closely has to believe that a greater power must be unleashed. A greater capacity within our humanity must be unleashed. A greater, more comprehensive, more profound, more sensitive engagement in this vital question must occur. And in my view, that can only come from a movement that is part of the citizenry itself. Do I believe that people have to be experts to be involved in this conservation world? Absolutely not. Is it not possible for a citizen to be concerned about justice without being a lawyer or a judge? Is it not possible for a citizen to be concerned about the education of children without being a teacher or an educator? All we have to have is a momentary reflection on what this world would be like in the absence of such a movement, and what it will be like in the absence of such a movement. The planet will remain, and the planet will stay. But if you can imagine high mountain areas without mountain goats and sheep, if you can imagine alpine plateaus that will never hear an elk bugle, if you can imagine savannas across which no troops of elephant will ever move, if you can imagine a world where great carnivores do not exist, if you can imagine a world where forests are silent because no birds sing, and surely you all can imagine this. Surely if we can imagine this, then we can motivate ourselves to do more for the natural world. I know that some people wish to believe that wildlife exists by accident, that all we have to do is keep us out. Take human beings out of the picture, give half the planet to nature, as E.O. Wilson suggests, and that all will be fine. But even if we gave half the planet, ladies and gentlemen, there's no border around that half. There is no great wall of nature around that half. The issues of migration, of disease transmission, of interaction with humans across those boundaries, the demand for resources inside it. There is no single, simple solution. There is not a species on this planet today, not a single one, not from the mountain gorilla to the blue whale, not from the coral reefs of Australia to the high Arctic of Canada, Greenland, Svalbard, wherever. Not a single species that exists by accident anymore. I hate to tell you, but that Eden has died. They will all exist now by virtue of the decisions you make, the decisions you don't make, or the decisions you refuse to make. We have turned the world into a very different place. And because of the amazing adaptability of animals, they have managed to deal with it to some extent, somehow, despite the extinctions. We have to continue to give them a fighting chance. But the chance will not be accidental. The chance will not be inadvertent. We will make the decisions to use animals sustainably. We will make the decisions to use the landscape sustainably. We will make the decisions to bring industrial undertakings and the sustainability of nature together. We will find a way to force upon the palate and the dining tables of political elites around this world. We will force upon that table the debate about what is happening with wild creatures on this planet. We will force that upon them by our actions, by our decisions, by our motivations, by our language, by our demonstration of concern. And if we don't, then we all best get ready for a lot more of the same. Because the myth of Eden is accompanied by the myth that all we have to do is turn human beings into voyeurs, which is also committed to the myth that somehow we can do the right things for nature by simply doing more of what we've always done. I'm afraid this is not true. We are at a point where the citizen conservation movement for nature has to take place. And I would argue that the places it most has to happen are in those places where the rule of law and the institutions of greatest strength and the greatest wealth and educational systems exist. And that means that your country, the country of Canada, the United States, any countries that have those circumstances have a far greater responsibility to action than any other. But all nations share in this responsibility. We have too few people who care, ladies and gentlemen, and those who do care are far too divided. It is in the inclusive understanding of what we share in common in an effort to conserve nature that the only hope for nature exists. Thank you very much.